three speakers that are coming from abroad. So my personal thanks to all of them that have come all the way to Galway. And they are coming to talk about successful examples of hydrogen being used already in the regions. So the first speaker is Jón Björn Skúlason. He's coming from Iceland, from the Icelandic New Energy. And Iceland was one of the first countries in the world in which they were using hydrogen as a fuel. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Jón Björn, and the floor is all yours.
So good morning. Good morning. I'm going to talk briefly about hydrogen in Iceland. It's now becoming quite a long story, as Poe mentioned. I wanted to start with introducing Icelandic New Energy. It's a fairly unique setup of a company. It's owned by all the major utilities in Iceland, by the government, by the university, by the research institutes, and etc. So in a sense, we combined everybody together into one company. And the goal of the company is to eliminate the use of fossil fuels in Iceland, which is a fairly big task. So probably I need some successors to take over my job to finish the job, but at least we're on the way. Change slides. Yes. This one? Okay. So we have, the government of Iceland started working on this quite early. We have the first policy measures taken already in 1998 with aiming to utilize hydrogen and or electricity instead of fossil fuels. We have various incentives in place, and that's the only way to start up to get this technology going. We were actually the first in the world to revoke VAT on zero-emission technologies, which was followed by Norway, but they did it then much better than we did, so they have more incentives than we have. But we are blessed with very high taxes, so it was with a VAT exemption on all vehicles and import rebate and lower annual tax, the zero-emission technology becomes quite competitive at an early phase, and that means you can introduce it quite fast. We still have all these incentives in place, and the government has now announced that they plan to ban or tax out fossil fuel vehicles by 2030, which of course is a reasonably ambitious goal. I think Norway is again 5 years ahead of us, but we'll see who beats each other. We have quite an ambitious increase in incentives from January 1st, 2020. The VAT incentives will continue onwards for zero-emission technologies. They will also be applicable for buses, or the aim of the government is to have VAT revoked from buses, and also from all charging stations, meaning that even if you buy home charging, the VAT, both of the charging station and the work done to set it up, will be VAT-free. Depreciation of cars, 100% in 1 year, and larger vehicles will be that you can take 200% of the OPEX to deduct from taxes. And that's, of course, a step forward and thinking towards trucks and larger vehicles mainly, something that we are very highly interested in, and I'll come back to later. Also, the government has announced quite an ambitious plan to increase funding for alternative fuel infrastructure. And we should notice that the government of Iceland has been very strict on that they're not choosing any pathway. They are trying to create a platform for any alternatives. And if you think about all the different alternatives of battery electric, hydrogen, methane, methanol, ammonia, dimethyl ether, all these different fuels, they can all be produced from the basis of electricity. And that's something we have a lot of in Iceland. So the government is open for any kind of fuels. And we are quite certain, for example, that battery technologies will not go on fishing boats. So we need a solution there. We don't see a solution for battery trucks, which are long-haul trucks and so on. So there will be a mixture of fuels, and I'll come back to that later. Briefly, the story, we started in 2001 preparing for a bus program. This is, of course, the first generation of fuel cell buses, which were deployed in 2003 in Iceland. Actually, there were 33 buses in 11 different sites. They were supposed to operate for 2 years, but we ended up operating them for 4 years because they were still in reasonably good condition. Then during 2008 to 12, we had about 30 hydrogen vehicles, both internal combustion engines and fuel cell electric vehicles. So this was the second largest fleet in the world. It was only California who had a bigger fleet of hydrogen vehicles, so we have quite a long history. The filling stations, of course, at that time are already obsolete, so they could only refuel 350 bars. After 10 years of operation, the electrolyzer was old. It was the Norwegian electrolyzer technology, so it needed refurbishment, and there was a lot of wear and tear, so in a sense, we shut down the operation in 2012. Some of you might recall that we had some economic crisis in Iceland from some bankers in 2008. So this created quite a difficult situation for any research projects. But we spent a lot of valuable resources on these projects, and it was kind of interesting to see that a lot of people said that the project was a failure because there was no continuance. It's interesting when you have research projects which do not end up with a positive result. Actually, the bus program ended up with all the results we wanted it. But for politicians and people who don't believe in the technology, it was easy for them to say it was a failure. And "I told you so" became a very top sentence when we discussed hydrogen, because at this time, battery electric vehicles were coming to the platform, and a lot of people thought hydrogen would be out. It's very important. What we have been stating is that politicians need stamina. It's very difficult to have politicians only working for 4 years. Maybe we should elect them for 15 years, because usually they think in 4-year terms, and that's not enough for a new energy paradigm. And we always said from the beginning, when the company was formed in 1999, we stated that it would take roughly 40 to 50 years to complete a conversion from one fuel to another. So if we would be complete into 2050, we thought that would be a success. And I think we're well underway. Both the politicians and the public always want to choose a winner. And it's kind of interesting when you have this debate about hydrogen and battery electric technology. Most people want to choose one of those. We are actually saying we don't foresee only a battery electric future. We also see a hydrogen future. So it needs to be a combined system. And a lot of people say there has to be one winner. But if you look at the fuel, what we have today, we have multiple different fuels. We have diesel, we have gasoline, we have different fuels for jets, we have different fuels for seagoing ships, and etc. So there is already a variety, and I think that will not change in the future. I made this graph some time ago, and if you look at hydrogen versus battery electric, the media is very controlling what discussion is going on. And this red represents battery electric vehicle, and if you go back to 1997, a lot of discussion was that battery electric vehicles would take over the world. Nobody spoke about hydrogen. 2004, nobody spoke about battery electric vehicles, and everybody said hydrogen will win. If you go to 2011, hydrogen was out again, and batteries were taking over all the discussion. But I think actually my hopeful development is that actually this combined. I think there's a major benefit for both. And I think more and more people are agreeing to that there will be a mixture of this in the future. But this is based on articles published in newspapers and scientific papers. So in 2004, there were almost no articles in scientific papers about battery electric vehicles, and therefore all the money went to hydrogen. But if we look at land transport in Iceland, this is how the segment is. You can see gasoline and diesel controlling most of it. The goal of the government was announced 10 years ago that in 2020 we should have 10% renewables in land transport by 2020, and we should have 40% by 2030. And as you can see, we're actually potentially making the goal. We have now 9.2% of renewable fuels in land transport, which I think is quite good. And if you think about it, all other energy utilization in Iceland is based on renewables. So in total, if you take the total energy consumption of the country, it's 80% renewable. So if we can get rid of fossil fuel, we're 100% sustainable. There's been a lot of discussion about the infrastructure buildup for different aspects. This chicken and egg issue is always discussed. No infrastructure, no users, and vice versa. People tend to forget that building infrastructure for battery electric vehicles is also quite expensive. If you're looking at fast chargers, now people are talking about 350 kilowatt chargers. You have semi-fast chargers, normal charging. There are issues with the grid. If you're going to have a large charging station every 200 kilometers where at least 20 to 40 cars can charge at the same time, it's quite expensive to do it. We still are fighting this plug issue. It seems, though, that will be solved in the future. Charging time is still an issue, and I don't think we will ever reach what hydrogen can do. But what we have stated is that charging at workplaces is the cheapest solution, and that's what we are mainly encouraging in Iceland, that we have charging at workplaces so people can charge there. But still, 90% of the charging in Iceland for battery electric vehicles is actually done at home. And that's mainly, of course, it's very cheap, and distances are not that long in the cities. So building the infrastructure is quite costly because nobody is using it. But hydrogen infrastructure is also very costly. You need special stations. We don't expect to be able to compete with the battery technology on prices. We are looking at similar prices for hydrogen and fossil fuels. Maybe when we have large-scale production, we will go be below the fossil fuel cost, but that will, of course, also depend heavily on what kind of tax system we're going to have on fossil fuel. We, of course, it's easy to store hydrogen in large quantities to refuel a lot of vehicles, and it's a good for balancing the grid. If you think about wind or solar or all these different aspects, the energy companies in Iceland are now also viewing hydrogen as a great production at site for different power plants, because then you can utilize the grid completely, but then we have, of course, have trucked in hydrogen instead of hydrogen produced on site, and this is what we are calculating. But if we go to what Iceland is mainly doing, we're a member of the Hydrogen Mobility Europe 1 and 2 projects. Those 2 projects have been combined more or less, and they are building 49 refueling stations in Europe, 1,400 cars and vans to be deployed. It's a 170 million euro project, 67 million in funding and 40 organizations. So this is the far largest European activity, and this is all across Europe. But I'm only going to talk about Iceland. In this project, we have 3 hydrogen refueling stations in Iceland. We have opened all of them. The first 2 were opened in June 2018, one in mid-center of Reykjavik, and the other one in Keflavik, close to the international airport. Both have trucked in hydrogen because we built the electrolyzer at the geothermal power plant about 20 kilometers away from the city. And then the 3rd station was opened in Reykjavik now last May. And the key, of course, is that we are now trying to show continuance, so not building just 1 station like we did in the old days, but we're building 3. Currently, we only have 22 fuel cell electric vehicles in service. So you can imagine the economics of these 3 stations. They are crap. But that needs to be done to sustain the future. And of course, if you look at the announcements of many of the major car manufacturers, the availability of vehicles will be quite high in the near future. And Toyota has indicated that the price of the vehicles will be close to gasoline in 2022 to 2024. So that's almost tomorrow. You can see here, this is our vision of the initial map for Iceland. The circle of Iceland is 1,400 kilometers long, so we don't need a very complicated infrastructure, but we decided still not to distribute all the stations. This is a young technology, and we wanted redundancy rather than to start distributing the stations all around the island. So, of course, the mobility of the vehicles is limited to about 350 kilometer range, because 350 kilometer circle around Reykjavik or the stations, because the range of the vehicles is about 700 kilometers. But our aim, of course, is to build the infrastructure as long as the vehicle come on road. And the main issue now is to get large users, so we're focusing heavily on trucks. Price-wise, to drive a hydrogen vehicle today in Iceland costs the same as to drive a gasoline vehicle. So it's roughly, we are burning about 1 kilo of hydrogen, and we're burning about 7 liters of gasoline, so it comes out as the same cost. For a battery electric vehicle, this is, of course, very, very different. So it's much cheaper. But of course, we foresee when we have larger production, our electrolyzer at the moment is 150 cubic meters an hour, which is 300 kilos a day. you need to build much larger stations and probably about 10 times that size. And to be able to do that, you need trucks or buses. And then we foresee the price of hydrogen at least at 8 or even at 7 euros per kilogram, and then we're much cheaper than gasoline. Here you can see the 3 different stations. The third station in May was opened by the President of Iceland, so there's a lot of interest in the subject. So that was a big event, and so we're striving forward. You can see some of the vehicles. Out of those 22 cars, we have 17 Hyundai vehicles, both Hyundai iX35 and the Hyundai Nexo, and then we have 5 Toyota Mirais. Looking at the next steps, this is our main focus at the moment. We're looking into deploying trucks in Iceland. You've probably heard stories about what Nikola Motor and Hyundai are doing. Nikola is going to provide thousands of trucks in the US during the time period of 2020 to 2024. And just as Anheuser Busch has already ordered 800 trucks, and they've sold, or they have orders for over a $10 billion truck production. Hyundai is going to launch 1,000 trucks in Switzerland over the next 4 years. We are now in negotiations with both of them to have trucks in Iceland, and our aim is to have some of these vehicles on the road in 2021. Mainly they are very heavy users. They, of course, they are going to exchange with a heavy diesel consumption, so it's not that complicated to provide infrastructure. The Nikola buses, the Nikola trucks are supposed to be able to drive 1,000 kilometers, so they only need 1 hydrogen station to drive the circle of Iceland. The Hyundai trucks in the beginning will drive about 500 kilometers, but that is to be extended soon. Buses, in Reykjavik we already have 14 battery electric buses from China. This is out of 100 buses, so replacing all the buses in Iceland is not very complicated. One of the negative part of the electric buses is that they burn gasoline or they burn diesel for heating in the wintertime. So the diesel consumption was almost 10 liters per 100 kilometers of diesel just to keep the buses warm. That meant, of course, that there was some diesel fumes coming into the bus, so the people were sitting on an electric bus and smelling diesel, which is not a good sign. But of course, this is all due to range. The bus company in Iceland is mostly interested in plug-in hydrogen solutions. That's what they interest the most. Such solutions are being developed at least by 3 or 4 different players. We are now tendering buses for Iceland, and we're hoping to see plug-in versions coming in. At least that's what the bus company is most keen on getting. There's a lot of discussion about on-site production versus trucked-in. I just touched on that. Today there's a major hydrogen production plant at one of the geothermal power plants. It's 1,200 cubic meters, so it's much bigger than the plant providing for the vehicles. But all of that goes into production of methanol. So they take CO and CO2 from the geothermal power plant and mix it with hydrogen, and then they get methanol. And methanol is then mixed into different gasoline in different countries. They actually export most of the methanol to the Netherlands and to Sweden. But we are now also looking into methanol as a future fuel for the fishing fleet. Methanol ships have the advantage of being able to burn diesel also. So that's, if you think about mobility of ships, and ships need to come into different harbors, if you don't have methanol infrastructure, they can just tank diesel. So their mobility is not, it doesn't affect their mobility of the ship. So methanol, of course, if we produce a large-scale methanol, we need a very, very big-scale hydrogen production, and that means the hydrogen becomes quite cheap for vehicle consumption. So we're looking into studies about trucked-in hydrogen versus on-site production, and that's just a continuing learning process as we go along. There's a number of companies interested in hydrogen. Most of them already have battery electric vehicles in service, and they cannot do all the mobility solutions. Of course, a lot of them are looking now for 4x4s, which we don't have yet. The largest oil company in Iceland is actually the owner of the hydrogen refueling stations, and they are building now multi-fuel stations. They're also distributing methane and fast charging at their stations. And they're also getting investment from partners abroad. So there is quite a high interest. We are foreseeing that the full tax incentives in Iceland will last until we have 5% of each zero-emission vehicle type. which means roughly about 10,000 vehicles, as we have 200,000 vehicles. So the government views it that if 5% of a certain technology is in traffic in Iceland, it must be commercial. So we already have, like for example, we have about 3,200 battery electric vehicles in service now, so we can sell 6,800 more until the incentive goes away. And we can see also the grants. We only had 0.5 million euros directly from the government in 2016 to 2019, but this will now go to 10.5 million euros for alternative infrastructure in 2020 to 2023, and that's already being advertised and being distributed to players. But this is not just for hydrogen, it's for any fuels. Just briefly, because since we have partners from abroad, we have done a lot of studies specifically with the people in the Faroe Islands regarding wind to hydrogen. So there's quite a bit of knowledge within the company looking into small-scale wind to hydrogen, mainly in non-grid connected communities. So we looked at a couple of islands in Faroe Islands which are not grid connected, and we're hoping that the government of Faroe Islands steps up the interest of executing such projects, because at least one of the islands showed quite a good economic case. And if you go to other places which we have worked with in Newfoundland, these are isolated communities where you have to fly in diesel with helicopters in the wintertime, so you can imagine how expensive the electricity is. So having standalone systems with wind and solar is actually something that is very viable in the future, and we just need some front runners to start executing such activities. As I say, Icelanders were pioneers. Economic crisis and the battery electric vehicle hype, I would say, slowed down the hydrogen movement, but didn't slow down the general introduction of zero-emission technologies. We have a very large Nordic cooperation. There's a very open discussion between all the Nordic countries. Denmark and Norway, of course, are currently most active, and I think you will just, after my presentation, hear about what's happening in Norway. So we are convinced that hydrogen will be a very important factor in the future fuels in the north. And with increased collaboration, open information flow, projects like this, and etc., I'm sure that we have found a political or support for hydrogen. And just as you know, hydrogen makes you feel good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Björn. So next speaker is Patrick Nuben. He's coming from